thank you all for coming. Phil Fisher was supposed to join us, but fell ill conveniently yesterday, and so we have a smaller panel. So I'm going to take some,
But mightier.
but mightier. Okay, you just keep saying that, and so
Women are mighty.
and and I'll take some liberties as a moderator and make some panelist remarks. Martha, you were very kind in that introduction. In my lab, we've been studying the effects of early stress on adolescents, children's mental, physical health, and in particular, the effects of the pandemic on their functioning, on their brain development. We had already known that COVID has taken a just unfortunate toll on children, adolescents, mental health. Rates of depression and suicide and suicidality have gone up. And I know that the next panel, I'm sorry, is on mental health in youth. So I'll try to stay away from focusing on that. And in that context, we're very fortunate to have two panelists who are broader than I am, and we can't easily stay away from just a focus on mental health. So I want to introduce to you today Florencia Torche and Jackie Wong. And we're just very fortunate today to have them as panelists here. Florencia Torche is the Dunleavy Family Professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford. In her research, she focuses on social inequality and social mobility, educational disparities, and marriage-family dynamics, with a particular focus on prenatal factors that we'll talk more about today, given the effects that the pandemic has had on pregnant women and their young children. Florencia is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Sociological Research Association, and the Board of Directors of the Population Association of America. Jackie, we're fortunate to have Jackie here. Jackie Wong is the Executive Director at First Five California. She's also Vice President of the Washington Unified School Board in West Sacramento and a professor in California State University, Sacramento's School of Nursing Credential Program. Jackie's a leader in public policy and program with a strong history of working in government, education, and nonprofit management industry. She's worked tirelessly over the past decades as an advocate for equity, health, and education to reduce poverty in children, adolescents, and families. So with that, I'd like to turn first to Jackie and then, I'm sorry, to Florencia and then to Jackie to just say a few words about what they'd like to make sure we discuss today. Florencia.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thanks to the organizer and to everyone for being here. It's great to be in person. So this panel, I was invited to talk about early childhood and the social determinants of health. I'm delighted to do so, but and I'm sure you have heard many times in this summit that longevity starts at birth. I'm going to make the case that it starts even before birth, and we do well to consider early life starting at conception, right? I'm gonna argue that the prenatal period, as early as we can measure, is tremendously important for the entire life course of individuals for two reasons. The first one is that the prenatal period is highly sensitive to the environment. And that might sound like common sense to many of you, but it's a novel discovery. Until not so long ago, people didn't understand that. This is from an epidemiology textbook in the 70s. The placenta is the perfect filter protecting the fetus from harmful substances in the mother's body and letting through helpful ones. We know now thanks to science, that that's not the case, and that vulnerability to the environment starts at conception. So number one, sensitivity to the environment. The second reason we should care about early life starting at conception is because the prenatal period is highly consequential for individual life, right? According to the fetal origins hypothesis, the prenatal conditions start a cascade of events that shape health, development, well-being until in adulthood and in late adulthood. The reason, one main reason for that is that the prenatal period is full of what we call critical developmental stages. A critical stage is a very brief period in which the environment can have an irreversible effect on a particular development, say the development of the central nervous system, such that later experience is not going to change that, right? So an apt metaphor is a window of opportunity. If a development doesn't happen during that window, it will not happen or to the same extent. The prenatal period is full of those developmental opportunities. Because of these two reasons, then I claim that early life, particularly the prenatal period, we should really care when we're interested in longevity and adulthood, older adulthood. And we should care about exposures in that period. The literature has focused on individual level exposures, for instance, exposures to alcohol, nicotine, drugs. That's great. That makes a lot of sense. But I want to move from individual to, so as the sociologist I am, to social exposures, right? Factors such as natural disasters, war and armed conflict, neighborhood violence, family conflict, pollution, discriminatory laws and policies. These are social stressors, right? And if they're experienced in the prenatal period, they may have long-lasting consequences for individual health and well-being of the next generation, right? Let me give you just one little example from my research. I found that a very restrictive immigration enforcement law that was passed in California in Arizona in 2010 had a negative impact on infant health among immigrant women who had the misfortune of being pregnant during the passing of the law. This effect affected not only the putative targets of the law, undocumented women, it affected, and even more strongly, documented immigrants. So I bring up this example only to highlight the extent to which institutionally created social stressors can really shape the health and well-being of the next generation. Not only the health and well-being, but also, and with this I'm going to conclude, the inequality in the next generation. The reason is twofold. First off, disadvantaged populations, so kids in low-income families, kids in racial and ethnic minoritized families are more likely to experience these social stressors. They're more likely to be exposed. Secondly, and in addition to that, disadvantaged populations are more likely to be impacted even given the same exposure. So this is kind of a double whammy for inequality, right? Based also on my research, I found that a very large earthquake when experienced prenatally, so in utero, resulted in lower cognitive ability among the kids who were in utero when the earthquake happened. But that negative effect, lower cognitive ability that of course shapes later outcomes, was only observed for kids in poor families. Kids in middle-class families didn't show any negative impact, strongly suggesting, of course, that advantaged families were able to fully compensate, right? So to the extent that these processes are at play, and they very much are in the US and all around the world, then these social stressors, when experienced early in life, will contribute to the health, well-being, and inequality in the next generation. I have focused on the prenatal period because of its relative invisibility. It's hard to see, right? But of course, these processes operate all throughout childhood. So I'm going to stop here and let Jackie talk about that. Thank you so much.
Wow.
If I may, I just want to say, I mean, the research is just spectacular. I just have to say, Florencia's research really builds on earlier studies where people didn't look at these, what we would call individual differences in SES. Women who were pregnant during Superstorm Sandy had infants who showed problems.
Mm-hmm.
The Montreal ice storm 20 years before that, women who were pregnant showed their infants showed problems. And your work showing that it's not an across the board effect, right? That it really selectively affects lower income, disadvantaged mothers, families, children is really important. And I think it's going to have implications when we start to look back at COVID and what it's done to women who were pregnant and isolated during this time. So we can continue that. Jackie, please.
Well, thank you for the work that you do and bringing kind of the a focus, a magnifying glass to kind of the social determinants of health, especially in those early years. How many of you actually are familiar with First Five California? Many of you. Oh, great. So 25 years ago, a man named Rob Reiner, also the producer of Princess Bride, funded a tax and Meathead, yes, Meathead, yes.
For old people.
For wise people.
Yes.
So funded a tobacco tax initiative that actually created the California Commission on Families and Children, because they had realized during that time, or he had realized, and a number of other folks had realized that issues of prenatal to 5 were not top of mind or even front of mind for many policymakers who are determining all of the things that we were talking about. Where do you get funding? How do we create the systems and the structures? So I had the privilege and honor of being the executive director and the first woman of color at First Five California, a refugee kid. And I'll share this with you because I think about myself when you tell your story. Born during the fall of Saigon, I decided to put my mother in labor on April 30th, 1975. So those of you who are around knew that that was the end of the war and the exodus of the American. And so refugee kid, born during traumatic experiences. Can you imagine? There's a whole lot of stories. Somebody tells me that I need to kind of write a book on it. But I'm here to tell you that the interventions that were provided to me, home visiting, we didn't call it home visiting at that time, support, access to healthcare, community of people and networks of humans, right? Strategically intervening in my life allowed me to be where I am today. And that is the story. There's a possibility in everything that we invest in First Five California, because we all know the science here, right? We know that in utero that there are 250,000 cells that actually develop every minute, the brain science, right? The neuroplasticity. We know that from 0 to 5, that there are 1 million synaptic connections made every minute. And by age 5, 90% of the human brain is developed. What does that mean, right? So again, it's really important for us. I had also the privilege and the honor of our former chair being the first Surgeon General is Dr. Burke Harris, and really deeply rooted in ACEs, right? And the importance of creating safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments so that we can actually heal, that the things that we experience in utero and 0-5, people can heal from. Right, there is actually a narrative out there in public policies of what can we do with throwing bad money out, but the research is there. There is brain plasticity in 0 to 5 that we can actually make specific interventions so that they can create the opportunities that I was afforded when I was a baby.
Could you describe ACEs?
Oh, so
no, that's okay.
Yeah.
Because that was really Nadine's
Yes.
baby, right? That she really pushed that through.
Yes, and there are lots of folks who have contributed. So the adverse childhood experiences are essentially they're different trauma indicators experienced by really by yourself that actually will determine whether or not you will be more predisposed to things like heart disease, cancer. This is a Kaiser study that we all know. George Halverson happened to be the chair before Dr. Burke-Harris. And that actually there is a research base, and if we experience a certain number of ACEs, that we will have poor, it determines poor health conditions, right? That is actually connected back to certain zip codes, certain ethnic, marginalized communities, and by zip code, right? Socioeconomic, determined by low SES and whatnot. So this is research-based, and really it was a study created out of Kaiser to try to figure out how to better serve their patients and communities. But what we had discovered is like, wow, like this actually happens. Like the experiences, the trauma that you experience early on in life, 0 to 5, really impacts these long-term longevity, quality of life issues that I'm not sure if like we really pay attention to. So for us, under Dr. Burke-Harris, we adopted a new North Star that we believe that that trauma-informed, healing-centered, culturally responsive systems will be that antidote, will create the safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments that are necessary to address these inequities and necessary for children's healthy development for the long term. Because if we do not do that, then we actually diminish the quality of life for our future and that next generation of kids, their kids. So we've also adopted a really bold goal that in a generation, 20 to 25 years from now, that we believe that every child 0 to 5 will have the safe, stable, nurturing relationship environments that are necessary for their healthy development. And we cannot do it without talking about part of this part of the lifespan, right? That is not just on the back end. I keep talking to separate people like, well, I'm at the front end. This is a Century Summit. What are we talking about here? And I'm here to tell you that what we're doing at 0 to 5 has long-lasting impact on the I don't want to say that, I was going to say the back end of life, but the later years of the lifespan, right? I also had, it's not in my bio, I had the privilege and honor of working with the Senate President, Darrell Steinberg at the time, and long-term aging was part of my portfolio. And many of the things that we're facing with long-term aging is very similar to 0 to 5. Right? So how do we actually elevate the voice, unite kind of this conversation about the lifespan, about the impact of social determinants of health, so that public policymakers can make the long-term investments that are necessary for the well-being of all of us.
Thank you for that. You've both talked about the importance of, to me, the importance of early stress, the adverse effects of stress, that it can be the beginnings of a cascade, that it's the front end of a longer term process. The scientist in me wants to ask you, so how does that happen? What is it about stress? Why? How is it doing that? Do you have thoughts?
I have plenty. I think you have better thoughts than me.
I have different thoughts, probably, but I'm curious as to, I think for us, the magic word is mechanism. What's the mechanism by which early stress, creates these subsequent problems? And I think you're identifying, Jackie, that there are now, so I started early on in my career studying offspring of mothers with depression and the effects of maternal depression on their offspring. There are now studies of 3rd and 4th generation of those families who have problems, right? So I'm going, but I want to come back to you. So the kind of, so exposure to COVID or exposure to Superstorm Sandy or an adverse environmental ACEs, what does that do to result in the adverse effects that you see in children?
So as you all know, this is a very active area of research. So I'm gonna share some insights from the literature, but we're learning so much, which is fantastic, because in order, of course, to address the issue, we need to fully, deeply understand the mechanism. So, you know, in terms of, let's think prenatal stress, what's going on? Well, one critical mechanism there is the physio-neuroendocrine response by the pregnant person, right? That shapes what happens with that gestation, and shapes it in many different ways, some of which are we're learning about. For instance, one very likely mechanism that leads to reduced gestations, preterm birth. And that's really important because we know preterm birth shapes outcomes throughout the entire life course, from cradle to the end of life.
Great.
There are many other mechanisms we're learning about. Those mechanisms occur at the individual level. And another aspect I wanted to highlight in this conversation about stress as the critical mechanism is a key distinction between chronic and acute stress, right? We were talking about these adverse events. They matter to a large extent because they contribute, they're persistent, repeated, continuous. It's not that one thing matters to you, it's the accumulation of adverse exposures, right? That is chronic stress, and it has been demonstrated that is tremendously nefarious. However, acute stress is also nefarious due to other mechanisms, such as the one I just highlighted, right? So a single event might shape a trajectory that is disadvantageous for you. And there's an interaction between the two. Some people claim that individuals that are unfortunately exposed to chronic stress build it's an overused concept, but it's an important one, build resilience. They learn to deal with their environment such that a novel stressor would affect them less. Some people claim the opposite. The chronic stress will really take a toll in the organism, this notion that you may be familiar with, the allostatic load, right? That really, it drains your reserves such that a novel stressor hits you harder. This is just to scratch the surface on the relevance and the different mechanisms and interactions that are involved when we think about stress. So I'm going to stop here and let Jackie.
That's perfect, please.
Yeah, I think that there is, I agree. And when I had first learned about kind of neurotoxic stress and impact from, so I was just floored at the basically, and I think I yelled out to my colleagues, it's like, it stops brain development, poverty, racism. It is chronic and acute. Right. And so what can we do? And it just, I mean, again, it just, building on that is like COVID also has highlighted that. Like, what do we do? There's research coming out. There are papers that we are actually going to start to fund about what is the impact on development. We talked about learning loss, and that's been all over the news with, LPI publishing that. But I would say the learning is lost. We need to recover from it. There needs to be a recovery model because there has been a lot of stress that has been experienced by the children that are coming in 2 years of not having contact with humans. And that, again, at the beginning of my opening, by the way, you need the human contact for cognitive development 0 to 5. Of those 5 years, 2 of them are gone. Right. And I'm not saying that what we were doing virtually did not help. And you have, Florencia, you have the deep research about the impacts in certain communities, right? Certain communities, again, we magnified the impact of COVID on brain development or the stress that was put on families. And we have a lot of work to do around that. And so I am concerned of what has happened during COVID. We have a national and state behavioral mental health crisis of children and youth. We have, I mean, this is why the governor funded a $4.7 billion investment in this, because you were beginning to see children as young as 2 start to talk about suicidal ideation. 2. They're 2. They're at the beginning of their life, but they were expressing depression, but not just depression, suicidal ideation that they no longer wanted to be here. Think about that. So again, how do we actually build out? How do we recover from this moment in time? What do we invest in when we think about, again, a century summit of the lifespan of the ages and stages of where we're at? How do we work together so that we're not investing and creating a system that is siloed and piecemealed? Because what I have studied over time, over my career, 30 years in different spaces, is that we tend to segment our investments. We do not talk about a holistic system. Right. And again, my goal, my North Star, is to create a holistic, trauma-informed, healing-centered, culturally responsive system. So we need to begin to talk about it in those ways.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And I think it's also important to remember that, I mean, COVID happened to everyone and all at the same time, but people were different ages when it happened. And the age at which you experienced isolation or when you experienced kind of being removed from your friends is different for a 3 to 5-year-old, where it might be for half their lives, than it might be for a 16 to 18-year-old, where it's unfortunate, it's 2 bad years, and it happened. So the effects that we found on accelerated brain maturation were in probably 16 to 18-year-olds. It could be transient. I mean, we're scanning them again at age 20 to see that. But I think it's, I hope we have to try to remain optimistic that we can do something about it. They are lost years for sure for some people, and more lost for some than for others. So I think knowing what the recovery programs look like, knowing if this is, what can we do to return kids, if we can, back to a kind of pre-COVID trajectory of development, so that not only can they continue adaptively, but their own kids to come, as you mentioned, intergenerational transmission, can also continue to do that. We have 5 or 6 minutes if there are things you want to say before I open it up.
No, I'm fine.
So I didn't mean to paint a negative, gloomy picture. There are interventions. Again, here I'm sitting before you. War. Those of you have lived through this, right? Again, mom during the fall of Saigon, right? We have made a strategic investment in home visiting and community health workers, right? To engage families at home. Earlier, Dr. Shaw was talking about home-based care. I'm like, that works on this end for prenatal care too. There's a for every dollar spent in home visiting or home visits in the prenatal to kind of post-birth stages, you get a $16 return on investment in health and mental health and well-being. That's huge. If we understand that that's what we should be doing, we can invest in that. We can invest in early quality, high quality programming in early care settings, in all settings, not just child development centers, not just schools, but a mixed delivery program where we're in home, that we're actually modeling and providing parents the tools that are necessary to create those safe, stable, nurturing relationships, right? And environments. and the communities and the environments that will heal, that will actually allow for us to find the recovery, right? The developmental delays can be closed if we are actually intentional about our investments. And that's what First Five is doing. These are things that we have researched. These are things that we are lifting up, right? And again, the culturally responsive nature of it all, to make sure that we are honoring the families of where they're at, because they are part of this healing journey, that we're not just going in, right? And when I talk about home visiting, it's not just about, hey, this is what I think is good for you, right? It is about how do you engage the community, the families, the parents, the tias, the aunties, the grandmas in this conversation about creating the bonds that actually will make a huge difference in the developmental gaps that we're seeing right now.
I want to actually to emphasize something
Yeah.
that you said, Ian, based on your brain aging
Please.
study, which is the enormous relevance of following up these cohorts that were exposed, right? We know from the abundant research that shows that there is very acute effects, and then some of them, negative and positive, of all sorts of exposures and interventions. Some of them persist or increase over time. Some of them disappear, right? So the enormous importance, not to forget that the crisis is not over, and to follow up these cohorts of different exposed at different ages to learn what happens with their trajectories and to generalize from that, right? Okay.
No, it's, and I have to say, in our sample too, and we had maybe 100 kids. We started with a couple hundred kids, and then we had 100 that we scanned after COVID. And of those 100, 10 had had an infection, and that didn't explain the brain findings. Right? So I just want to emphasize, it's not just were you infected, or, I mean, it's important, but it's not were you infected. It's were you stressed? Did you experience the stress? Were you exposed? And everyone was exposed. We don't have a control group of, except maybe Florida, right? But otherwise, we have kids who were locked down, shut down, and we just need to understand what was. Sorry. So
you couldn't help yourself.
I couldn't.
Help yourself.
Inhibition just flies out the window. Can I open this up? If there are questions for Jackie or for Florencia? You in the front.
you in the front.
Laura, my wife.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for this. My question was really about the interventions and who do we give the interventions to? So there's this abundant evidence that these early stressors have negative effects on children over their long trajectories. Some of that, no doubt, is because those environments stay the same. So if you're born into an impoverished family, that family is likely to stay impoverished. So some of it is just being reinforced by the continued environment, as opposed to punctuated at one point and then it's just continuing, right? And this relates to this. So what do we do as an intervention? And my question really is, do we just try to intervene with the kids who are stressed, or instead do we build early childhood environments that are nurturing and stimulating and welcoming and kind for everybody, and not separate those children who need a special intervention from those who may have come from more privileged backgrounds?
Laura, that's right. We all, I mean, I don't know. That's absolutely right. Like the amount of stress of shared experience of the trauma, I would say actually is really good for adults, right? That's why we run our media campaigns based and steeped in this ACEs research, by the way. So I don't know, many of you have seen our Dragon campaign. We have actually a campaign running right now, a bridge campaign from our Talk Read Sing that was actually supposed to educate, begin to have the conversation about brain development, but now we're shifting to kind of ACEs-based research and engaging, and this is for everybody, right? That's what a mass media campaign is. Rob Reiner, again, he knew there was something about ensuring and making the ground fertile for people to understand that it impacts everybody, and the opportunity to heal is environmental. I would also say that it's not an or, it's an and, right? So we treat the environment, we make the ground fertile, and then when we see the disparities, how do we become targeted? How do we ensure that yes, there's universal preschool for all, but who's really accessing that? And what are the on-ramps for that? And how do we actually make it more accessible? And if it's not accessible in the K-12 system, how do we actually go to home-based care providers? How do we actually provide the professional development for those family friend and neighbor situations where we know the research is there? Like if we teach you family friend and neighbor, also known as grandma, right? Many of us actually have grandmas watching our babies sometimes. Like these are the latest kind of tools and interventions that will be effective for children's development. Then we get somewhere, right? So again, I would say, and for example, we have universal pre-K, but then we are being strategic about where are children receiving these high quality educational interventions.
Let me interrupt. If
Oh.
we can do one last
Oh, sorry,
question,
2
that's
seconds.
okay.
I can talk forever.
Please.
Okay, a couple of folks in the online audience are wondering how two-year-olds have the cognitive capacity for suicidal ideation.
Right. That's a good question, but they're expressing it. They're expressing it to their pediatrician. They're expressing it to when they're well baby check. They're expressing it to their parents, and so. And I would say that that's why we also want to support the dyadic care benefit that we are rolling out in the state of California. That is generational. What babies are feeling, parents are also feel like they react to their caregiver. And I'm not, and see, I'm looking at your face. Like they're not seeing your face. I'm seeing your face here online. The online folks are, but just that's something to consider. Like, what is the environment? What are the adults? What are they? How are they even articulating that? Because it's somewhere in the environment, right? So it's not a lot, but the fact that there are a handful to me is like as as a trained clinician, having been in the space, it's like, wow.
Let me thank you both for the time that you took, and thank you all for engaging.
Thank you.